Jim O'Neill, the former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, coined the term BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China. We know thereafter that S has been added, being South Africa. But Mr. O'Neill doesn't like to give South Africa much credit. However, we did catch up with him for his latest views on emerging market economies as a whole. Let's hear what he had to say.
First of all, as a political group, the fact they've actually come up with something specific after meeting for 6 consecutive years is quite a development. They were struggling the past 2 years to agree on many basic things about this, and the fact they've now agreed it. Interesting that it's going to be headquartered in Shanghai after all the back and forth.
They're kicking in most of the money, aren't they? They could have worked on the name a little bit better.
I mean, the most important thing is it's now a permanent symbolic sign that global governance is a mess. Global governance has not kept up with the pace of global economic change, and particularly with Congress not ratifying the G20 agreement, what was it, 2010, that was based on 2009 weights of GDP. It's already out of date anyhow, but Congress won't even ratify that. So these guys are thinking, well, you expect us to keep on putting more and more money in the IMF, and you won't even give us the weight we're supposed to have all agreed we should have? Forget it, we'll have our own.
So does this fund, the contingent reserve arrangement, as I'm saying, not exactly a catchy name, does it take on the likes of the IMF and the World Bank in terms of dominance and power plays?
I think it's a bit of a stretch to start thinking things of those kind of degrees so early on, but we'll have to see what they really want to do with it. I mean, what one can think of a whole host of big projects that are in the interest of those countries that they jointly finance: infrastructure, alternative energies, energy efficiency, clean water, something that I'm going to be heavily involved in from September onwards, the growing resistance to antibiotics, big problem in China and India. So there's a ton of things these guys can do.
But isn't it just a vanity project for the Chinese? A lot of people say it's just self-serving.
I don't think so. I think that's not really the Chinese way. It could be regarded as a vanity project for them all collectively. They've all got their own development banks which spend plenty of money, but I actually think the Chinese purpose is to sort of tiptoe into experimenting with more global responsibility. It's, on the one hand, these guys all complain about not having bigger share of the IMF and World Bank, but of course with that goes more responsibility. And occasionally in discussions I've had with senior people in Washington, that when they've offered it, the Chinese are like, oh, didn't really mean it. And I think they're a little bit scared of what having more global responsibility means. So by doing it through something like the BRICS Bank, it's a bit of a lower risk way of exploring this greater responsibility to others, I think.
So you do cover central banks after all. You watch
what
they're doing. Come
there you
on.
go. It's just that I don't know what the Brazilians are going to do. So.
Nice position to be in. What about the Russians, if we can move on to elsewhere in the BRICS as well? Of course, you are the man who, for those who don't know, who created the acronym all those years ago as well.
It'll be on my tombstone.
Well, yeah, funny you should talk about stones, because the last 2 speeches I heard you mention, they were public speeches, but in the pay of Goldman's, were talking about turning over stones in these countries, in China and Russia. Remember that speech?
Yeah,
You've done it a few times. I saw it at least twice. But the point is, people keep...
All my speeches were always individual and tailor-made.
Okay, fair enough. But I saw one very similar twice. But the point is, you say people keep turning over the stones, and they're not finding much in China as well. But are they finding stuff in Russia that they shouldn't like at the moment?
Well, I just heard your interview with Tony. I was waiting to come on. You know, it'll be interesting to see how far the Europeans really go. I mean, I think he's dead. I mean, it's easy for Washington to shout and scream and make all these noises because it doesn't mean anything to them economically. For some parts of Europe, Germany and Italy in particular, it's a big deal. One of the most interesting things throughout the whole dispute to me was, I think the day after Crimea was annexed, the CEO of Siemens appears in Moscow for a meeting with Putin. At the Ambrosetti Forum, which you guys covered, I was on a panel about the emerging world, and we did a survey at the end to all these European corporates, which were the countries they're most interested in investing in. This is weeks after the Crimean annexation. After China, the second next one was Russia. So I'm not sure that continental European politicians are going to be that tough to really start causing damage to their multinationals.
Here's the issue. I was at the World Petroleum Congress in Moscow, and whilst you find it very difficult to find a European or US CEO who's willing to be seen with Mr. Putin or Mr. Sechin in public, we know that a lot of these deals are being done. We know that a lot of energy deals and conversations are happening as well. So how far does State Department, Foreign Office, EU broad policy, how far does that go now to infringing on those activities, which we know are going on? Rex Tillerson may not put his arm around Vladimir Putin or Igor Sechin in public, but we know that the relationships remain, and that's the fact. But does international policy from the politicians thwart that activity?
Well, I think Washington would like to, but and as with so much else these days, Angela Merkel's key, because is she going to kind of say okay, or is she going to listen to Siemens and the other big European companies who are going to say, look, this is Washington just being a little bit narrow-minded, we have to take blah 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 blah. So my suspicion is that she'll be very tiptoeing and not want to go too far. I was an interesting thing with some investors, including George Soros, a couple of weeks back before I went to Brazil. And the mood there was that the threat of sanctions is actually really bothering Putin. It's not the actual sanctions, it's this never-ending risk of what's coming next. And not only is that stopping money coming in, but it's adding to more and more money creeping out. So it was not something I had focused on. That was interesting to hear.
Good content. Jim O'Neill, the former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, talking to our colleagues at CNBC Europe.